Welcome to our old friends, new friends, and the East West Center family. This is an especially auspicious beginning to a new season of China Seminar. This is our 45th year, and a few days ago was Professor Dan Kwok's 90th birthday. Dan, as you know, is the founder of China Seminar, and we're pleased to continue the tradition he started so many years ago. China Seminar is honored today to have as its speaker for the new season, Dr. Tarsisius Kabutalaka. He's associate professor in the University of Hawaii's Department of Pacific Studies, and he's a native of the weather coast of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. He received his doctorate from Australian National University and his undergraduate and master's degree from the University of South Pacific. Tarsisius has done extensive research and publication on China's growing influence in Oceania, and he brings a lot of academic and personal observations about what's going on in that part of the world. So China Seminar is proud to welcome him as we observe this 45th anniversary of the program. Tarsisius, the floor is yours.
Mahalo, Gerard. Now, mamanao hamu hita sai mata tutuhunu, mamanao hira tamanina vereneni hira kanakamauli nineni Hawaii. Thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this, and given that the China Seminar has been going on for a very long time, so it's wonderful to be here. So what I'll do is simply have conversations and raise a couple of points. So this will be more talk story. I'll raise a couple of points that hopefully will engender discussions afterwards. And the issue of China's growing influence in the Pacific Islands is not new. It's something that we've seen being discussed in the media a lot recently, particularly in the last decade, but more so in the last 5 years or so. And there's been a lot of academic writings and research on it as well. So there's a lot out there already that people are talking about, and some of you are probably engaged in these discussions. Sorry. So in terms of academic discussions, if I could just plug it out there, I think one of the best books on China in the Pacific Islands came out last year. It's called The China Alternative: Changing Regional Order in the Pacific Islands, which is edited by my colleagues Graham Smith from the Australian National University and Terence Wesley Smith, and it's available online for free. And so what I'll be providing is more, some preliminary thoughts on China's rise in geopolitical competition in the Pacific Islands. And here I use the term Oceania to refer to Pacific Island countries and territories, but not necessarily to refer to Australia and New Zealand. They are important partners and an important part of the Pacific Islands region. But the reason why I do not necessarily include them in today's discussion is that because they are also part of the powers that are involved in this geopolitical competition. And so, there's a lot of Australia, New Zealand part of the Pacific, as well as powers in the Pacific. And I have divided my comments into 4 parts. The first is I'll provide an overview of Oceania as a site for geopolitical competition. And then second, what I'll do is provide an overview of the rise of China and what that looks like on the ground in Pacific Island places. And then make some comments on Western countries' responses. And then raise 2 questions that focus on the Pacific Islands. And the questions are, what does it mean for Pacific Island countries being at the center of increasing geopolitical competition? And second, how have they managed their place in the midst of this geopolitical competition? How are Pacific Island countries dealing with it? Now, as we all know, Oceania has, particularly in the last decade, found itself at the center of increasing geopolitical competition, once again, the site for increasing geopolitical competition. And this time, as we know, it's between China on one hand and the US and its allies on the other. And this was particularly evident beginning from the mid-2000s, when the Chinese state's presence and influence became much more visible and also much more assertive as well. And since then, what we've seen is reaction from Western countries, led in particular by the US and Australia, and have attempted to reassert their presence in the region and their dominance, which they had enjoyed for a long time since the post-Second World War period, and to counter China's growing influence. And their efforts are often framed around the narrative that they have been here for a longer period of time, have had interactions with Pacific Islands region and people for a much longer period of time, and that this is their sphere of influence, that this is a place, Oceania is a place where Western countries, particularly Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, France, and so forth, have enjoyed dominance for a long time. Now, the reason I said earlier on that Oceania region is once again seeing itself at the center of geopolitical competition is because we have had similar experiences in the past during the height of the Cold War period. At that time, much of the discussion focused on the former Soviet Union and its alleged influence or its influence in the region. And there are 2 points that I want to make about this. The first is that I think the Cold War period is a little different from what we are seeing now. And the reasons are, one, for most of the Cold War era, many of the present-day Pacific Island countries were either not independent. Samoa was the first in 1962, and then a lot of them in the 1970s. So either they were not independent and therefore controlled by former, some still, colonial powers, or they had just gained independence from the 1960s and 70s and into the 80s, and therefore were trying to figure out their foreign policy and their relationship with other countries. And so young nation states trying to figure out how they relate to other places. And of course, what's happened at that time was that they tend to align themselves with the former colonial powers and their allies, because that was the existing relationship that they had and which continued after independence. Of course, Samoa and Fiji established diplomatic relations with China in 1975, Papua New Guinea in 1976, Tonga in 1998, and Kiribati from 1980 to 2003, and then they switched to Taiwan from 2003 up until 2019, when they again established diplomatic relations with China. Nauru for a very brief period from 2003 to 2004. So by and large, most of the Pacific Island countries, when they gained independence, their traditional partners were Western countries, Australia and New Zealand, of course, and the US, France, which still has territories in the region. The second point I want to raise about that period of time is that China is a different power from the former Soviet Union, which, as I mentioned, was the center of much of the geopolitical discussions in the region during the Cold War period. And the reason why it's different is that the former Soviet Union, I do not think, had the same kind of presence in the region that China has today. Yes, there were incidents and agreements like the Kiribati Soviet agreement on fishing in 1985, and there were other presence of the former Soviet Union, but not in the same kind of intensity that we've seen with China today. both in the form of the presence of the Chinese state, as well as the presence of Chinese investors, of Chinese people, and Chinese cultures. Now, some of these have a longer history. For instance, Chinese people have had a long history in the Pacific in the 1800s and into the 1900s as well. And furthermore, what we've seen that is different from the Cold War period is the way in which China transformed over time. So China, from the time that it established diplomatic relations with Samoa and Fiji in 1975 and Papua New Guinea in 1976, is no longer the same China. The China, as we know from the late 1970s onwards, had emerged as a global power, at least economically. And so we are dealing here with a different power than we did with the former Soviet Union. And therefore, I think that's what makes it different. And so the current geopolitical competition in the region and the situation which Pacific Island countries find themselves in is in many ways different from the Cold War era, I would argue, that it is much more intense, that it is more demand to Pacific Island countries in terms of their diplomacy, in terms of their time, in the energy of their governments and their public servants as well, in ways that they did not have during the Cold War period. And in this discussion, both from China as well from the US and Australia and Western countries, is that I often see this narrative that Pacific Island countries are viewed as both sovereign nation states, and therefore, as sovereign nation states, they must be respected, and their right to establish diplomatic relationship with anyone they want. And so on one hand, there is that idea of Pacific Island countries as sovereign nation states that need to be respected, while simultaneously being unable to make the right decisions and therefore needing assistance. That yes, we recognize your sovereignty, we recognize your right to build relationship with whoever you want, but at the same time, we also think that you are somehow unable to make the right decisions at time, and therefore we need to assist you with this. I'll come back to this point later. But the question I want to raise here is, how did Oceania find itself in this situation? And I want to begin to answer that by looking at China's growth. And this is a story that I think many of you are very familiar with. I mentioned earlier on that we saw the presence of China increase and become more assertive from the mid-2000s. And in particular, some people have pointed to 2006, when we had the first China-Pacific Islands Economic Development Cooperation forum that was held in Nandi, and Beijing announced that it would provide $492 million to the 8 Pacific Island countries that had relationship with PRC at that time, and that these assistance would be in the form of concessional loans. So we begin to see China, although China has had a history of providing assistance to Pacific Island countries since the 1970s, what we are seeing from the mid-2000s is that an increase in the amount of assistance as well as the different forms of assistance. And those of you who are familiar with Chinese assistance know that it comes mostly in 4 types of assistance. The first is grants, and we often do not see a lot of grants. So in the case of Solomon Islands, up until recently, the Chinese assistance in the construction of the Pacific Games, into policing, and so forth, since the establishment of relationship in 2019, that has been grants. Until recently, with the plan to set up telecom towers around the country, that will be concessional loans. But much of the assistance to Pacific Island countries is in the form of concessional loans. So grants There is commercial loans, there is concessional loans, and of course there is interest-free loans. So those are the different types of assistance that China provides, and for Pacific Island countries, like in other parts of the world as well, that it's largely been in the form of concessional loans. Now, in talking about Chinese assistance, as I mentioned, China has a history of providing assistance to the Pacific Island countries, but in the past decade and a half, especially, this has gone up dramatically, so that by 2009, China was the third largest aid provider to the region after Australia and the US. And Chinese assistance to the region makes up for a small percentage of China's total foreign aid, but it is increasing. So in terms of global Chinese assistance, the Pacific is really, really small, but we've seen it increase over the years. And as I mentioned, most of it is in the form of concessional loan. This has raised a lot of concerns that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, concerns about increasing debt for Pacific Island countries, and concerns about debt book diplomacy, and that China would come back and claim some of these places if Pacific Island countries are not able to pay. I must say that we have not seen that as yet in the case of the Pacific. In the case of Tonga, which owes most to China, that what they've done is they've renegotiated the repayment time for the loans. And so they haven't forgiven the loan, although the Tongan government at one stage wanted to rally Pacific Island countries to try and persuade Beijing to forgive the loans that were taken after the riots in Nuku'alofa in 2006. And so, you know, in terms of China taking over things as a result of non-payment of loan, we haven't seen that. But we've seen countries in the Pacific Islands with increasing debt owed to China. But also, I think it's important to note that in totality in the region, debt to China, most Pacific Island countries have a lot of debt to other institutions as well, particularly Western-based institutions. The other way in which we have seen an increase in Chinese presence is Chinese trade. That by 2009, China became the second largest trade partner in the region after Australia, and an important export market for a lot of Pacific Island countries. China is the largest trade partner for some of the island countries, like Solomon Islands, for instance. So long before 2009, when Solomon Islands switched to PRC, Solomon Islands has had a long history of trade relationship with China. And so if one were to see that, one could argue that it would eventually turn into a diplomatic relationship. A lot of it is focused on one commodity, the logging industry, which is at the moment a declining industry. And then the other thing is that, you know, over the years, we've seen a lot of assertive diplomacy on the part of China. So China assistance, Chinese trade, and more assertive diplomacy on the part of China. And this was happening at both bilaterally as well as multilaterally through the Pacific Islands Forum. Beijing has used a number of mechanisms to enhance its credibility and visibility as a development partner that Pacific Island countries can trust. And this includes things like visit diplomacy, for instance, where Pacific Island leaders are taken to Beijing and welcome as leaders of sovereign states. And we've also seen President Xi Jinping come to the Pacific Islands in 2014 and 2018, a kind of high-level visit that we haven't seen, or Pacific Island countries haven't seen from, say, countries like the US or other Western countries. And so that meant a lot to Pacific Island leaders, I think, the visit diplomacy. The other issue is education diplomacy, that there is an increase in the number of scholarships of Pacific Islanders going to school in China. And we've seen that both bilaterally in terms of the bilateral relationship, as well as multilaterally in the Chinese scholarships that are provided through the Pacific Islands Forum. And so a lot of Pacific Islanders are able to go to China to study for degree programs, as well as professional training, from things like sports all the way to things like policing. So a wide range of scholarships that are provided as part of this education diplomacy. We've seen China use health diplomacy like other countries. So it's not only China. In response to COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen an increase in Chinese assistance to the Pacific. We've also seen an increase in assistance from other countries, as Australia, the US, and so forth. So health diplomacy became really, really important. And I think this assertive, more engaged diplomacy that Beijing employed has been quite successful if we were to measure it in terms of countries that now have diplomatic relations. We know that Solomon Islands and Kiribati switched diplomatic relations from the Republic of China to PRC in 2019. Now, in talking about China, one of the things that I want to mention, and perhaps we could think about in our discussions, is that there is often a tendency to think of China as monolithic. And that when we are talking about relationship with China, we tend to focus only on the Chinese state. But what we've seen in the Pacific Islands, and I am sure what we've seen in other parts of the world, is that China is much more complicated than that. And that involved in the diplomacy, involved in building these relationships, involved in the engagement with Pacific Island countries are different entities that are part of this thing that we call China. And I want to focus on two of those. So three things in particular. One is the Chinese state, which I think we are all aware of. The second is the role of Chinese companies. And I think it's important to understand the role of Chinese companies in Chinese engagement with Pacific Island countries. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And the third is Chinese citizens or people of Chinese descent. And that's also a complicated mixture as well. In terms of Chinese companies, the relationship between different Chinese actors and the relationship between these different Chinese actors is complex, and they do not always act uniformly. So they do not always act as one. That in some cases they support each other. In some cases, Chinese business people or Chinese citizens act in ways that are completely different from what Beijing would expect. So let me look at companies very briefly. We have seen, as I mentioned earlier, an increase in Chinese investments in the region by individual Chinese entrepreneurs, but also by Chinese companies. And these Chinese companies are made up both of SOEs as well as private companies. And as we know, the SOEs have a very close relationship to the Chinese state. But there are also private companies, as private as you can get in China. And a lot of these private companies do not have the same kinds of connections that SOEs have. But they come to the Pacific Islands, establish themselves as investors in Oceania, and then try to create connections in order to access the kinds of funds that are available through the Chinese state. This is what Henrik Sasowski, in his study of the Belt and Road Initiative in Fiji, refers to as reverse image engineering, that they come to places like Fiji or Solomon Islands, set themselves up, and then say, hey, look, this could be counted as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and therefore could be included in the Chinese state's agendas out there in the region. In some cases, that is successful and they have access to funding through Chinese state. In other cases, they don't. And a lot of what Henry was talking about was investment in infrastructure development. things like real estate in places like Suva. And I think understanding of the role of Chinese companies is important to understanding Chinese diplomacy in the region. Graham Smith from ANU and Deng Huasang from ANU have also researched and published on Chinese companies in the region. And the reason why they are important is that oftentimes they are at the forefront of relationship with Pacific Island places. So you take a company like CCECC, for instance, that has a contract in, say, Solomon Islands, a contract on a project that is funded by ADB. They go in, they establish themselves. They build connections to the political and bureaucratic elites in those places. And they become the face of China before the state comes in. And we saw that in the case of Solomon Islands prior to the 2019 switch, that in fact, some of those relationships that were established was by companies like China Harbor Engineering Company, as well as companies like CCECC. And those companies come in, they establish themselves and are able to win other contracts, either from the Chinese state or from other funding sources as well. So yeah, so I'll just put it out there, the importance of companies in our understanding of China's engagement with the Pacific. The second group that I wanted to look at is Chinese people. And there is often the discussion out there that there is a huge difference between the old Chinese and the new Chinese who are coming in. And in the Pacific Islands, we've had, generations of Chinese who came to the Pacific in the 1800s or the early 1900s. So you have third, fourth generation Chinese in the Pacific. But I think the difference between the old and the new Chinese is much more complicated than the story that is often put out there. Because there are cases where there are relationships that are built for purposes of business, relationships that bring together old and new Chinese as well. Not necessarily in the interest of the Chinese state, but in the interest of ensuring that they have access to products or markets in China. So a complicated relationship. And in the case of, and I'll take Solomon Islands as an example, there are also cases where Chinese businessmen, some old Chinese, some new ones, who over time have the ears and the eyes of our political elites, and therefore are able to influence and have direct access to these people. It is true that the same thing can be said of business people from other places as well. But we've seen it increasingly with Chinese, partly because there are more of them, in the case of Solomon Islands, in investments in natural resource extractive industry, particularly logging, but increasingly in the mining industry as well. So they're present in the country. Over time, they build relationships, they acquire citizenship, and therefore are able to influence political decisions at the local level. So in order to understand the geopolitical competition, I think one also needs to understand the domestic, the things that are happening at the domestic level that then influence, take for instance, decisions on things like the kind of MOUs that Solomon Islands government signs with Beijing, and knowing where the decisions were made or how those decisions were influenced. So Chinese people, again, really, really complex. Again, Graham Smith has written a lot about this, particularly with Chinese diaspora in Papua New Guinea. And Henrik, in his work, also looks at these people in Fiji as well. So complex relationship there. Now, what I've said so far is that we've seen an increase in Chinese presence. We've seen an increase in the assertiveness of Chinese diplomacy. And also we've seen an increase in Chinese influence at the local level. Now, the big question, and one that I think is of interest, particularly in the US, Australia, and other places, is the question whether Chinese presence and influence will eventually lead to not only diplomatic competition, but strategic competition and dominance in the region. And there are different opinions, as we all know. I'll come back to this in my final point. But let me very quickly turn to the issue of Western responses. I'm running out of time. I'm going to go very quickly. I think the audience here is very familiar with how Western countries led by the US and Australia are responding to China and their concerns about China's growing influence. And as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of this stems from strategic concerns, but also, as I said, influenced by the narrative that they have a longer history of interaction with the region. And this is their sphere of influence. They have control much of the Pacific for a very long time. And China threatens that. China threatens their sphere of influence. And by extension, China threatens Pacific Island countries. That's the narrative, that because China threatens their sphere of influence, therefore it threatens Pacific Island countries as well. And that assumes that the interests of Pacific Island countries and the interests of Western countries are the same. Of course, Pacific Island countries often think otherwise. And a lot of Western responses is framed around things like the Indo-Pacific, for instance, framing of Western responses, initiative, and also individual countries also respond in particular ways. So at the very broad level, we have this discussion of the Indo-Pacific, and then individual countries like the US has its specific pledge, Australia, its specific step up, Aotearoa, New Zealand, its Pacific reset, Great Britain has the Pacific uplift. So nearly every Western country that has had an influence in the region is reframing its engagement with the Pacific, finding ways to best engage, and ultimately finding ways to counter China's growing influence. And then on top of that, you have countries like Australia that see themselves not only as a middle power in the region, but Australia often sees itself also as part of the region. And therefore you see in the lingua of diplomatic relationship in the region, things like, the idea of the Wu Valley or the family that you hear Australia and New Zealand talk about a lot, that we are a family in the region, and therefore the interest of Australia and New Zealand is similar, if not the same, as the interest of Pacific Island countries. Now, very quickly, let me turn to Pacific Island responses and bring back the questions that I raised at the beginning. And they are, what does it mean for Pacific Island countries? And how have they managed their place in the midst of this geopolitical competition? I won't have time to answer all of it, but let me throw a number of things. I think there are two levels in which this geopolitical competition impacts Pacific Island countries and through which Pacific Island countries also respond. The first is the national level, and that Pacific Island countries have, since gaining independence, become much more mature. Maturity does not always mean much more responsible, but much more mature in their engagement with the international community. And so they view themselves as having the sovereign right to engage with Australia, the US, and other places, and at the same time be able to engage with other countries around the world, including China. And they often see China as an additional development partner, addition to the traditional development partners like the US, Australia, France, the UK, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and so forth. So China is not necessarily outside of their way of looking at how they engage with the world. China adds to that engagement. And that's true if you look at the fact that a lot of them, especially the big Melanesian countries, have a huge trade relationship with China. And so that engagement is really, really important. The second level of regional engagement is through, a second level of engagement is through the regional organizations, through multilateral arrangements. And Pacific Island countries come together through collective diplomacy and set their own agendas or frame the region in their own terms. And at the center of this, since 2017, is the idea of the Blue Pacific, which, at the center of the idea of the Blue Pacific is regionalism and an ocean-centered and ocean-centric definition of security that centers climate change as the most important existential threat. And we see that in the Boe Declaration. Now, what we've seen is that, the geopolitical competition could undermine all this. It could undermine regionalism. It could undermine the effort of Pacific Island countries to create a much stronger regional response. We've seen this in, an increase in Beijing's multilateral engagement. So traditionally, Beijing tended to engage more bilaterally, but more recently, we've seen Beijing engaging more multilaterally as well. Through things like the organizations like the Pacific Islands Forum, as well as through foreign ministers meeting. And recently we saw Beijing attempt to fast track a multilateral, what they call common development vision, which was rejected by Pacific Island countries. On the other hand, the US, Australia, Japan, UK, and Aotearoa and New Zealand established the partners in the Blue Pacific that had its first meeting in Washington, DC in 2002. And so such arrangements go outside of the regional framework and could undermine regional architect and regional processes for decision-making. Now, what we've seen as a result of what we've seen in the last 2 years is the rift within the region, the 5 Micronesian countries threatening to leave the Pacific Island Forum. Now, I'm not saying that it is the geopolitical competition that directly influenced that, but over time, it could undermine regional cooperation within the Pacific. The reasons for which the 5 Micronesian countries wanted to leave the Pacific Island Forum, and Kiribati in fact did, might not necessarily have anything to do with the geopolitical competition. I do not have any evidence to say that it is these differences at the geopolitical competition level that is influencing decisions at the region. So let me very quickly conclude by making 3 points. My first point is that China is a power that is here to stay. And although there is no evidence that I've seen, and of course others might have seen other evidence, to suggest that Beijing has an intention to dominate the region, I think it is also important to acknowledge that powerful countries tend to eventually project themselves in different ways. So diplomatically, economically, and multilaterally, and militarily. And I know that there's been a lot of discussions in the region about the potential for the establishment of a military base in Solomon Islands, or earlier on in places like Vanuatu, or the rehabilitation of the airstrip in Kiribati. And out of that, there's been a lot of discussion that what Beijing is doing is that it's moving forward to having a military base. I'm not sure that there is evidence enough to suggest that, but one would be naive to think that a growing power would eventually in the future not need those things. My second point is that Western responses is likely to intensify the geopolitical competition in Oceania. And this could result in increasing militarization of the region, and especially the way in which Western countries respond to China's increasing influence. And I hope that I'm proven wrong, that it does not result in the kind of militarization that we saw during the Cold War era that included the testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific Islands. And my third point is that Pacific Island countries at both the national and regional levels will have to find new mechanisms to better manage their relationships with other countries in this era of geopolitical competition. And this will not be easy given the size of Pacific Island countries, and also given the fact that many Pacific Island countries are dependent on these development partners, including China. And so managing that relationship is not going to be easy, but I think it is important that Pacific Island countries find mechanisms to manage it. At the regional level, I think there is a need to re-examine the regional architectures that were built during the Cold War era. And yes, they have changed over time, but maybe perhaps need to re-examine that and see how the regional organizations, particularly organizations like the Forum, provide mechanism for engagement that will ensure peace in the Pacific. Thank you. I'll stop here and we'll open it up. Sorry, I've taken more time than I had intended to.
Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much for a terrific outlining of this incredibly complex region, and not just China's role in it, but all of the outside countries. In fact, there are a number of questions here, but there's one that just popped up that I was quite from Ashramani. Let's make it even more complex. Are there more engagements with other BRICS or other countries, Mexico, Indonesia, other emerging economies beyond the sort of West China paradigm that you've talked about? And might that be a hopeful sign if that did develop? I mean, you were talking about broadening the horizons of the region with China, so wouldn't that make it even a more internationalized, globalized place?
You know, in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a lot of discussions in the region about the need to look north. And people like Ron Crocombe, those of you who know Ron, he was a professor at the University of the South Pacific at that time. And he said that Pacific Island countries for their future need to look beyond the traditional partners. And by looking north, he meant Asia. And of course, not just Southeast Asia, but East Asia and other parts of Asia as well. We've seen a bit of that. And I suppose this China engagement is part of that looking north that started, you know, a while back, but became much more pronounced in recent years. But one of the countries in Southeast Asia that's often not talked about in their engagement with the Pacific is Indonesia. So Indonesia is a huge economy, a huge population. And Indonesia's engagement with the Pacific Islands has increased over the years. I think they also have their own framing of the Pacific. If I'm not wrong, I think it's called Pacific Enhancement or something. And so you have Australia's Pacific Step Up, New Zealand's Reset, and so forth, and Indonesia has its own in looking at how it engages with the Pacific. And I think Indonesia's interest is in twofold. One is trade, of course, but Pacific Island economies are relatively small. But also important is the issue of West Papua. And Pacific Islanders or Pacific Island countries have in the past traditionally raised the issue of West Papua at the UN and other international forums. And so this increased Indonesian engagement, I think, is also a way of trying to address that. In fact, the Indonesian Foreign Affairs Minister was or still is in Honiara at the moment. But yeah, Indonesia is one of those places. And yeah.
You mentioned, you talked quite a bit about the Chinese investment and Chinese commercial presence. And you talked about the debt issue, and that you haven't seen any signs so far that they're trying to use that to leverage equity ownerships and that. But another common complaint over the years, especially in Africa, is that these Chinese companies, when they come in, they bring their own employees, and they do not. The economies themselves don't benefit, or at least the labor force does not benefit from that. Is that an area of friction that you see coming up in the region?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of that discussion in the Pacific Islands region as well, not only in terms of people coming in from China, but also products coming in from China. And when locals are employed, they're paid at a much lower rate than they expected. And so there's that complaint. But I think the other thing is that China, or these entities that we include as China, are also very dynamic, and that they're learning how to compete at the international arena and readjusting so that they can fit that. And we've seen cases of that in terms of the construction of dormitories, for instance, in Papua New Guinea, and companies coming back and making sure that they do not do the same mistakes they did previously. And so they're learning as they compete for contracts and things on the international arena. Pacific Islands, of course, is in terms of the volume of business is not the same as Africa, but the businesses that we have, yeah, there are some issues about that, but I think it's also important to point out that they are dynamic, learning these things and trying to readjust.
You made a quite interesting point about the effectiveness of Chinese businesses going in as businesses and creating relationships with the political and commercial elites in these countries. How is China viewed by ordinary people? What's the, are they as what's the general impression? I realize that's a ridiculously general question to ask, but what's your sense of that?
I think it varies across the region, and it's a difficult question to answer. So at the state level, at the government level, of course, for a lot of people, China, for a lot of governments, China is an opportunity for trade and so forth. But international relations often do not impact domestic political decisions like elections, for instance. So when Kiribati switched from Taiwan to PRC, there were discussions that might influence domestic politics within Kiribati. I'm not sure we saw that. But having said that, I think for a lot of Pacific Islanders, and if you go to a place like Honiara, so you arrive at the airport and you drive into Honiara, you will drive past what one of my colleagues call the Great Wall of Chinese shops, that they are, nearly all the shops are owned by Chinese. And so for a lot of Solomon Islanders, and I'm sure the same with the little shops in villages in Tonga, the Falekaus, or the shops in Apia, and also in Papua New Guinea as well. So for a lot of our people, their encounter with China is with these people. That's the veil through which they see China. So China is the Chinese shops. China is the Chinese storekeeper. Of course, those entrepreneurs, the Chinese storekeepers in those places, do not necessarily represent Beijing. And most of them are from places like Fujian or Guangdong. And so they come from Fujian and Guangdong, establish their businesses, and try to be as far away from Beijing as possible. Yes, some of them have connections. Most of them don't. And I think, my colleague Graham at the ANU has done a lot of good work on this, on Chinese diasporas.
Mm-hmm. April Herlevy has asked, what do you think the Pacific Island nations can do to help ward off this increasing militarization or potential for increased militarization of the region?
That's a difficult question. My thing is that, powers like the US or China, or to a certain extent Australia, but more the US and China, they're going to do what they want around the world. And the challenge for Pacific Island countries is trying to manage it. In the case of the Pacific, I think, individually, as individual countries, that's really, really difficult. And that's why collective diplomacy and regionalism, I think, is central to the Pacific. And we've proven in the past, like the Rarotonga Treaty, for instance, the anti-nuclear treaty that was signed by Pacific Island countries and nuclear power, could not have been done individually. That Pacific Island countries were able to do it through collective diplomacy. We've proven it in the tuna agreement with the US as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, yes, sovereign individual countries in the Pacific are important. And ensuring that we understand how China operates, that we understand how the US operates, to be able to engage with them in meaningful ways.
Mm-hmm.
Take, for instance, we need to understand who makes decisions and what are the kinds of relationships between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China, the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Finance, who gives the money. The man that we talk to at the embassy is probably from Ministry of. We need to understand how Chinese assistance works in the same way that we do need to understand how the US, and that's important.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, I think regionalism is so important to this part of the world.
I mean, just is there any possibility that these nations could come together and try to have a demilitarized zone of covering?
I mean, that's an issue that could be discussed. I mean, they had in the past had discussions about nuclear testing.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that other countries have seen that in very negative ways. And the relationship between New Zealand and the US became strained as a result of those New Zealand saying that they will not accept nuclear-powered or nuclear-carrying vessels into New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can have that discussion. And I think it's important that they have it. Enforcing is another issue.
Mm-hmm. Duardic McNeil draws attention to your mention of the Blue Pacific strategy. And so what conversations are the region having with China with regards to its role in combating or contributing to climate change? How's that playing out?
My understanding is that there are lots of bilateral discussions with China, and China, at least rhetorically, says that it will contribute to Pacific Island efforts. Of course, it's quite different when you go to international forums as well, like the big environment discussions that you have internationally. So yes, there's a lot of positive rhetoric. There's a lot of positive discussions at the national levels. But I'm not really sure what China, in terms of real commitment to climate change issues in the Pacific.
One last question from Charles Morrison. Again, addressing the debt issue and again addressing collaboration among these nations. Do you think the Pacific Island nations would prefer some sort of multilateral discussion of aid that includes China, or do they feel that they'll get better deals individually?
That's a good question, and there's a lot of I think there's a lot of regional discussion about assistance that's provided to Pacific Island countries. But what we've seen is that, a bulk of Chinese assistance has been bilateral. And I suppose because they have had a history of dealing with countries bilaterally and want to do that. But we've seen a change in recent years, and China is beginning to engage more at the regional level as well. And perhaps that engagement could, over time, result in discussions on things like Chinese assistance or assistance from other countries as well. So it could potentially lead to that. But at the moment, I don't know, to be honest, Charles.
Well, thank you very, very much. This has been a remarkably enlightening presentation.